What's up, riders? My name's Chewy. Today I'm going to be reviewing the EXT Extreme Racing Shox Storia LOK version long-term review. Now, I've had this shock on my Zero for 2 years. I ride a Zero because I care about suspension. I ride a Zero because I care about suspension performance. So the EXT Storia LOK is a fantastic shock. If you don't want to watch the rest of this video and you're thinking about buying it, just go and buy it now. Turn this video off, go and buy the shock. It's fantastic. There's a few reasons I like this shock. Number one, it's a coil. So every time I get on my bike, it feels exactly the same as the last time. I've had a lot of different air shocks over my time. I always feel that they are a little bit inconsistent in how they feel. Every time, every trail, I'm kind of always fiddling with the low speed just to get it just so, and it's never how I remember it. So having that consistent feel is a must. Every time I get on my bike, it feels exactly the same. Now, the small bump sensitivity of this shock is second to none. I actually had it head to head with a custom tuned Push Industries shock, and I actually preferred the feel of the EXT over the Push. Now, it's very difficult when you're describing how something feels to put it into words. It's something that mechanics struggle to communicate with their riders, and riders struggle to communicate with their mechanics, because everyone has a different way of describing things, and it's very hard to understand what a rider might mean by saying a certain word or making a certain action or a certain noise to describe how the shock is performing or how it feels. And that's something that mechanics and riders have struggled with for a long, long time. Now, I'm going to try my best to communicate how my shock feels to you guys today so you can make an informed purchasing decision. Now, when I was comparing the Push with the EXT, don't get me wrong, the Push is an amazing shock. If you have one of those, I'm sure that you are incredibly impressed with it. But the Push versus the EXT, some of the ways they differed in their handling or feel characteristics was the EXT has the small bump sensitivity that you can feel, whereas the Push has a small bump sensitivity that you can't feel. So the feeling of the Push almost removes you from how the trail feels, if that makes any sense. It's very, very plush in the sense that it feels like you're almost riding on a cloud. You almost can't feel the trail, which is not necessarily a desirable characteristic, and yet it is a very desirable characteristic. When you're trying to get something set up perfectly, not being able to feel the trail can almost make you ride a little bit slower. But that said, the EXT, you can actually feel exactly how the bike is performing underneath you. It almost becomes an extension of your body, if that makes any sense. Being able to feel exactly how the trail is means that I can push a little bit harder and find the limit incrementally. So I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but both of them can probably go as fast as each other and handle the trail as well as each other, but one you can't feel the trail as much as the other. And I like to be able to feel exactly what the trail's doing. So if it's wet or if it's slippery, then you can dial your speed up according to the trail conditions. Now, that's something the EXT does perfectly. The tool-free low speed adjustment works very, very well. You can actually dial off too much low speed compression to the point where it doesn't have enough, which I find is not easy to do in other shocks. Other shocks, you take all the low speed off and you can't seem to get enough small bump compliance or small bump sensitivity, but the low speed on the EXT does exactly what it says on the box, to the point where I start at about 3 clicks before I feel that's wide open for me. 3 clicks from all the way open for me on the EXT is my starting point. I never run it wide open. I feel it doesn't have enough dampening wide open, but after 3 clicks is where I feel the range starts for me and my bike. And then after that, if I want to add a bit more pedaling performance, a little bit more stability in the low speed compression, then it does exactly what I expect it to do. Now, some shocks you can wind clickers all day and you can't feel any difference, but the EXT, it does exactly what it says on the tin. So the low speed compression, you can dial in as much platform, you can dial in as much grip as you like with that low speed compression, which is very nice to have. And it's tool free and it's easy, it's only 2 turns of adjustment. The high speed compression you definitely need to dial in on the trail. Now, I find it's best to dial in the high speed compression kind of long term. I start with it on 2 clicks from wide open, and then I'll slowly dial it in over the course of maybe 1 or 2 months. So I started with very little high-speed compression and then rode it for quite a long time, so I wasn't coinciding those adjustments with anything else. I had the shock fully dialed in how I liked it. I had the rebound, the sag, everything sorted first, and then I dialed in the high-speed compression last. I ended up with quite a lot of high-speed compression on my shock, which they almost warn you against. They kind of tell you not to do it. Now I kind of put that down to me owning a Zeroed and riding that. The ability to run a bit more high-speed compression is something a little bit complicated that I won't get into, but I found I'm running about halfway on the high-speed compression. One complaint that I do have is the high-speed compression can only be adjusted with a 12mm open-end spanner, which is a massive pain in the ass because you have to specifically pack and probably go and buy a 12mm open-end spanner to be able to adjust it. You can't do it with a ring spanner, you can't do it with any conventional tools or pliers, you have to use a 12mm open-end spanner. It is what it is. It's not super annoying, but if it's not something that someone generally carries with them, you ask anyone on the trail, hey, have you got a 12mm open-end spanner? The answer is going to be, no, I don't. No one has a 12mm open-end spanner on the trail. So that's a little bit annoying. The rebound is another thing that you definitely have to adjust on the trail. I can't get any car park testing feel of the rebound on the EXT shock. I can put it wide open, bounce it in the car park. I can put it all the way in, bounce it in the car park, and I just can't sort of figure out where it needs to be. Normally with other shocks that I can do a bit of a car park test and a car park setup and get fairly close to where I need to be, maybe within 2 or 3 clicks of the rebound sort of adjustment, but not with the EXT. It's something you've got to ride and dial in over maybe a couple of days or a couple of long trails. Now, one very important thing to consider when you're setting up any shock is to get the sag right first. You've heard it a million times, but it is super important on any coil shock to get the sag right first, especially on the EXT, because it only has 2mm of preload adjustment that you can put on the spring itself. Now, the good thing is these springs from EXT come in 25-pound increments, and when you send all your details to EXT to buy your shock, they're going to ask you what bike you ride, what terrain you ride, and how heavy you are with your riding gear, and how you like your bike set up. And they actually send you the spring option that they think, and then a 25-pound heavier increment in that spring. So you get 2 springs with this shock, which is very, very nice. So I actually, when I first sent my details to EXT about my Zeroed, about my weight, my riding style, they sent me back a 350 and a 375 spring, and I actually ended up on a 450-pound spring. Now that's after we went and tested all the different springs. It is probably on the firmer side, but I like the firmer spring for when you're hitting the big stuff fast. I could probably drop it off 25 pounds, but it's still quite a bit above what they actually first sent me. Now they have done a lot of research and changing around with their spring options since then, so I'm sure they've got it dialed by now, but I actually went up 100 pounds from what they recommend. So whenever you get your spring, make sure you go to the shop and have someone that knows what they're talking about help you set up your sag first, because that is a huge factor on determining the performance of your shock and your bike and making sure everything's working correctly together. Now there is one niggly little thing that I dislike about the shock, and I've told they've changed it on the version 3, but whenever you compress the suspension, that initial low speed stroke has a little titanium ball click sound that moves inside the shock. Now that's an integral part of the design, there's nothing wrong, but it's a small clicking sound. And if you're like me and have your bike set up so it's perfectly quiet, I run a Zeroed bike, no derailleur. I have chain slap protection all over my bike, and I use an Onyx silent engagement clutch hub. So my bike is perfectly quiet. All I can hear is trail noise and that little tick, 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 tick sound you get every time you compress your suspension is a little bit annoying. Now, when you're on the trail, you can't hear it at all. But when you're pushing your bike and you push your bike over a little bump, you hear it tick, 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 tick. It's one of those things that just drive me wild. I'm a little bit OCD anyway, but I'm sure it won't bother anyone else. But that's one thing I didn't like about the shock, and it's one of the very few things that I can pick holes with in this shock. This shock is a brilliant, brilliant shock. You can see by the finish, the build quality, the weight of it, that this has been very well thought out. It's made by a suspension company that make rally and race car suspension. Now these shocks that they make are very, very high quality. I'm very excited to get on the version 3 and feel the ride quality characteristic differences in that one. So I'm going to bring you the review and the comparison on that very shortly. Now one other thing that the LOK has, and the reason it's called a LOK, is a lockout switch or a pedal platform. So when you're doing the long enduro climbs, you can lock out the suspension. And that lockout, I find, is very well thought out. When you lock it out, it's not a harsh lockout. So if you do trail ride it, or if you forget to turn it off, you can actually get away with it. It's not super stiff. It does blow through quite nicely, but it does make a nice platform for when you're sitting in the saddle and doing a long climb. The lockout switch, I find, being able to blow through like it does, is very nice. One thing that I noticed with the Fox X2 lockout switch, it locks out the low speed compression only. And what will happen is, when you're riding, it locks out the low speed compression, and it actually packs up, not packed down like an extra Rebound does, it packs the other way to the top of the suspension. So if you drop into a trail and it's locked out, you're sitting at the very top of your suspension travel, and it feels horrible. It feels like you're gonna go out the front door all the time. It's not a nice characteristic at all, having that low speed lockout. It's really, I didn't like it at all. But the EXT lock switch kind of locks it in the sag position, and it's able to move up and down, and it's able to blow through, and it does feel very, very nice. I'm not sure what circuits it does lock out, but it has a very nice feel to the lockout. And if you do forget it, which everyone does at the start of a trail, you forget to turn your lockout switch off, you get to the bottom, you think, fuck, I forgot to turn it off. And then your mates look at you and you're like, yeah, you're a twat. Now, one other adjustment that I do want to talk about is the spring preload. There's not much preload adjustment on this spring, but it is very sensitive to preload. So once you get your sag settings set up and you want to dial it in on the trail, I would recommend just playing with the preload. You can adjust it in 1/8 turn increments, because there is little detents on the shock body that the spring preload nut sits in. So there's only 8 spots you can do for 1 turn, but I actually use that preload adjustment quite a lot. For example, if I adjust the angle of my handlebars, if I roll my handlebars forward or back, that will change the suspension characteristics of the rear end to the point where if I roll my handlebars forward, it will make the rear end sit up a bit higher. So I will undo my preload 1/8 or 1/4 of a turn. If I roll my handlebars back, it'll get my weight over the back, so I'll increase the preload. Something you guys can think about if you do already own one of these shocks and you wanted a little setup tip for maybe setting it up for a steeper track or a different cockpit setup, different stem lengths and things like that. Have a play with the preload, because that will get you your balance back between the front and the rear. Anyway, that's my long-term review on the EXT Storia LOK shock, guys. I hope this review helped you make up your mind of which shock you want to buy. Now, if you're sitting on the fence and you're wondering whether to buy this shock or not, definitely grab this shock. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece of engineering. It makes your bike feel perfect. Yes, they're expensive, but yes, so is your high-performance carbon bike. Why not make it perform to its full potential? Go and grab one of these shocks and ride on, guys.